afternoon, everyone. It's good to see so many of you join us today. In a few moments, Mark will be introducing Scott Hammond, who's doing today's talk. But first, I'd just like to remind you that we are recording today's event. And I just wanted to say, I noticed we've got 137 registrations, which is a new record for us. So Scott and the Shetland Space Centre have drawn in our biggest crowd yet, my goodness. And just over half of you are new to us, which is great, and just over half of you are not members of the BIS. And Mark's got a few words to say about that, which I'll pass on to him in a second. So I hope you enjoy today's talk. The way it'll work is I'm going to be muting everybody and keeping you all muted while we're actually doing the talk. And then when we have our question and answer session at the end, I'll ask you to try and attract my attention. I'll give you instructions back then as well. You can do that either by physically waving at me, which I do pick up, or by putting something in the chat, and then I can pick it up from there, and then I can order the questions for Scott at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to my colleague Mark, who's going to run through today.
Thank you, Bob. Could you bring up the first screen, please? And good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. So if you could move on to the second screen, please, Bob. So welcome to our May talk. And as you've already heard, and as you know, we're very lucky to have Scott Hammond from Shetland. And so we're expecting about a 30 to 45 minute talk, followed by questions and answers. If you could move on, Bob. So for the magazines, JBIS, Chronicle and Spaceflight, we're always looking for articles. I have copies of Spaceflight and JBIS here. That's what so if you feel like you could write an article for those, please do write into headquarters and contact the editors. They'd be very pleased to hear from you. If you can move on one, Bob. And then, of course, please join the BIS. We're always keen to have new members. You get access to the members site where there are lots of recorded talks. You get the camaraderie of enthusiasts and professionals via the BIS, and you get the magazines and newsletters and across the social media side. You can move on, Bob. And that's, again, another plea. Please join the BIS. We need the money. With that, I'm a minute over time, but I'll hand over to Scott to give us a talk about the first commercial vertical spaceport. Over to you, Scott.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'll start to share my screen, hopefully. So this is a photo of Liability, which is the launch site. It's as far north as you can get in the United Kingdom. Beyond there, in the northerly direction, the next stop is effectively Alaska. So we do get some quite cold winds, as I'm sure you can imagine. Behind where the rocket is taking off, you can see the rest of the island of Unst. Got a population of about 600. It used to be have a lot more than that when the RAF were up there, as the RAF had a station there which supported the air defence radar, which is now back but is run remotely. And if you just look towards the right-hand side, you can just see the buildings of the old domestic site, which is about 4 kilometres away from this point that you can see where the rocket is taking off. And that's really where our story with Unst started. So back in about 2005, Frank and Debbie Strang bought the old RAF domestic site, and since then have been running it as a tourist destination, hotel, hostel, etc., etc. So they've been very much a part of the community for the last 15 or so years. They've got a house there, and as I say, they've been running a successful business there. Now, the other thing is, we'll come back, is I always think, what I'm doing is quite a challenge, and sometimes it's quite difficult to get that over to the UK Space Agency in particular, who tend to concentrate on the rockets, which are, the exciting bit and all the rocket science. But then I look at what Peter Beck, I'm sure you all know him, the CEO of Rocket Lab, and when he was at the SmallSat conference in 2018, he was quoted to say, if you think developing a rocket is difficult, try building a spaceport. And I very much tend to agree with him with that. I think I've never developed a rocket, but when you're developing a rocket, you are in charge of a lot of things that go on. When you're building a spaceport, you're having to deal with all kinds of external organizations, government organizations, the public, clients, etc., etc. So a lot of the time, you're not directly in control of a lot of the decision-making processes that actually will affect the spaceport. So really, I guess that's sort of, my sort of call out that I really am, doing a difficult job. Just quickly on my background, I think something was put out. So I'm not don't have a direct space background. I had a career in the RAF as a pilot. And during that, when I was, I got a lot of specialist training on missiles, satellite technology, guidance technology, etc., as all part and parcel of when I was a weapons instructor. So a lot of that has enabled me to start, lead this development here in Shetland. And I think that's really quite important, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a commercial spaceport. New space is all about commercial space. So it's moving away from the Arianes, the really large governmental organizations putting very serious satellites up into space, to the small sats, which are commercially driven and are contributing to commerce here on the surface of the Earth. And so it's very much trying to bring the lessons and experience from other industries into the space industry to make it work in a more cost-effective commercial manner. And clearly, background in aviation, a lot of what we do around the spaceport, very, very similar to aviation. A lot of the concepts are very similar. And then when we look at expected casualty analysis, well, you won't be surprised to hear that the military do a lot of that anyway. So again, a lot of what I've done in my my years of work have really led to this position. So just moving on then, a quick, what is the UK Vertical Launch Programme? I'm sure you'll all be aware of the UKSA tasked with winning 10% of the global space market. And for that, they had identified launch as the missing piece of the value chain. So they kicked off with a UK Vertical Launch Programme back towards the end of 2017. And you'll probably remember at Farmer in July of 2018, they announced who were the winners of grants for what they named the Pathfinder launch. And the three grants went, one to Highlands and Islands Enterprise, who are developing the spaceport in Sutherland. And they got about £2.5 million to aid them with the design and development of the spaceport. And then I'll come on to Lockheed last. And then £12.5 million went to Moog, again, a Lockheed Martin company, but they're developing the orbital maneuvering vehicle, and that's the Pathfinder payload. And then really important from our point of view was the £13.5 million went to Lockheed Martin, and that was to assist Highlands and Islands Enterprise in the spaceport development and also the procurement of a rocket for UK Pathfinder launch. You'll be aware that the plan was for that Pathfinder launch to occur in 2020. Well, we're already past that. A lot of water has gone under the bridge since 2018. One of the big parts of that, of course, was that Lockheed have decided to move from Sutherland to ourselves in Shetland, and we've been working with them for about 24 months now on the design of the spaceport and the range to meet that UK Pathfinder launch. And the current timing for that, the launch is planned for May 22. We're coming under a certain amount of pressure on that because that's in and around the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, and there's a lot of ideas of trying to sort of tie the two in. That will give us an added challenge, but it also gives an added impetus to the whole project that we're trying to make it in time for Her Majesty. So I'll come on to what I call the easy bit. And that's actually just building a spaceport. That is relatively easy because effectively it's a launch pad, which is more or less, concrete. It may have various depths and various weights, but very much known how you do that. And a large industrial shed. Yes, inside the industrial shed, you'll have clean rooms, etc. But all of that process is well known. So the process is you go through is you have to do an environmental impact assessment, and that kicked off about 3 years ago now, where we started with all the bird studies, because here in Scotland we have the Scottish Natural Heritage, or now they're called Nature Scot, and they wanted 2 years worth of bird studies, both within and out with the breeding seasons. And then there's also otter surveys, etc. And then you move on to doing surveys of peat and all these bits and pieces. But that is very much well known. That's a well-trodden path in how you do that. The differences started to come in with safety and your site selection. So the site selection process had to be very much driven by safety. Where could we locate the site so as it was in the safest position so for third parties that are not involved in the launch, and also noise, because that is the new thing. So when you build an airport, yes, there's noise, and there's going to be noise from rocket launch. But what does that noise, and it sounds daft, actually sound like? What is actually the impact of that noise? And because we were already embedded in the community, we were very, very keen to make sure we got absolutely the best scientific studies to show what noise is likely to be. So I had a good look around here in the UK, and unsurprisingly, not a great deal of experience here in the UK on rocket launch noise. But when I was also looking through the CAA web pages for our airspace change, I noticed that part of that, again, you have a noise analysis, but they said that there's a software system called Rumble, which they would accept for part of the noise analysis for the airspace change. So I did a bit of investigation on Rumble, and it was designed by a firm called Blue Ridge Mountain Noise Consultants out in America. And I had a look at them, and these guys have done about 25 noise studies for NASA. They've done them for SpaceX. They've done it for Firefly over in the States. And they've got a long history of actually doing some very, very cutting edge work on noise from rocket launch. And then more importantly, once they'd done the predictions, they would go along and monitor the launches and get feedback to make sure that their Rumble software was still accurate. So we went to them, took a while to sort of discuss exactly what we wanted here in the UK, because there are differences between the US and the UK in how we view noise, what our threshold levels are. So whilst we got Blue Ridge to do the technical part of the noise, we had a UK noise specialist to actually UKize it so as we could bring it into UK rules and regulations. So that was really the only sort of new bit I would suggest of building the spaceport. The rest of it, very much a well-trodden route. So what about the difficult bits? Well, it's how do you build a commercially sustainable spaceport? And for us, it has to be commercially sustainable. that we can get regulated and licensed by the UK Space Agency. How can we do that when the regulations do not exist? And that's really the big conundrum, is what risks are you prepared to take when you start to think about your design of your spaceport and locations of spaceport, and how your concept of operations, how you want to run the spaceport, when you really have no clear idea of what the regulations are going to look like. So for that, we really had to start to look at what's the government risk strategy and appetite. And in fairness to the UK Space Agency, they did quite a number of plenary sessions to signpost their thinking. And so we could get quite a clear idea of where their risk appetite was. For instance, we're expecting there to be a cap on liabilities, which is very much in line with what happens the rest of the world. About 60 million euros is about the average. And their risk strategy is going to be very much based on ALARP, which is, again, very well known over here in the UK, but not so well known actually to like American launch providers. So there's a certain amount of education we have to do there. We also needed to look around for international examples of good practice. Now, that clearly made sense to us, but it also made sense to the UK Space Agency. And this quote is from their advisory notes to spaceport license applications. And effectively saying, if you can identify good practice and standards, you can use those and you don't have to do the explicit comparison of costs and benefits. And then they go in to define what they think good practice would look like. And it's written down, well-defined in established practice, adopted by an industrial stroke occupation sector. Well, for us, immediately we thought that has got to be the FAA regulations over in the States, been going for 50 plus years, during which, third party, that there haven't been any deaths. And they've learnt en route, as they've built up all of those regulations. So we went straight to FAA CFR 417 and 420. For those of you who've looked at those, we're very much two countries separated by a common language. So actually identifying quite what the Americans mean and what we mean, it can be quite tricky. And the Americans come at things in a difference to us. They don't have the pure ALARP. They give numbers and say, if you hit these numbers, then you effectively get licensed. If you can't hit those numbers, then you have to do specialist studies to show why it's still safe. So a slight difference. There's also differences in how we view societal and collective risk. That being said, they're still pretty similar, and from our point of view, they gave us something that we could immediately get our teeth into and look at and start to design and locate the spaceport to meet the FAA regulations. Now, we were doing all of this before we had Lockheed on board. Since getting Lockheed on board is even more important because any American rocket still has to be FAA licensed. So they will have to meet the 420 regulations. So by ourselves adhering to that, it will allow also in this case, ABL, to operate quite happily from Shetland. As I say, the UK government, through the Space Agency, put out quite a lot of advice, and in particular this table over on the left-hand side showing what their regulator, their tolerability of risk is. Again, from my aviation background, and particularly in the military, this is a very well-known system. It comes from safety management systems where the duty holder will be told that they're either in the tolerable region or broadly acceptable region. Nobody will be in an unacceptable region. And even with ALARP, you had to have a certain amount of numbers so you could work to the expected amount of casualties. So you can see there on the left-hand side for individual risk, effectively we're in the new development. A tolerable region would be 10 to the minus 5. But we would want to work straight to the broadly acceptable 10 to the minus 6. And the reason for that is if you're in the 10 to the minus 5, you've got to do quite a lot of work to show that it's ALOP, that there is nothing more that you could do to get it to 10 to the minus 6, albeit whether it's too difficult or too expensive. And then you have societal risk on the right-hand side. The 1 to the 10 to the minus 5 is quite interesting because that's actually part of the risk analysis for shipping. So that sort of starts to bring in that. And then you've got HSE with 10 to the minus 4 of 50 or more casualties. So working within the FAA regulations, if we're driving to 10 to the minus 6, then we very much feel that we will satisfy the UK regulations, particularly with Health and Safety Executive and the UK Space Agency. They also had a look at around the world, and you can see on the right-hand side here. So under 417 of FAA, yes, they work 10 to the minus 4 for launch, but really it's the individual risk that we're interested in, 10 to the minus 6, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move on. And you can see elsewhere in the world, individual risk generally comes in at 10 to the minus 6, although the French are slightly different with 10 to the minus 5. So very much the UK is operating, where others operate, and therefore, again, coming back to using the FAA regulations, we felt quite confident that by using those, we would be able to, as I say, get a regulated and licensed spaceport. So when we come to do a spaceport license, this is quite clearly a CAA slide showing the 5 different licenses that are required. 3 will apply to us. We'll be looking to do sub-orbital launches, but I'm not going to concentrate on that. We're also going to get a range license, but again, I'm just going to concentrate on the left-hand side, the spaceport license. Now, what I would say is this slide doesn't cover everything you have to do for a spaceport license, but it gives you a good idea. So safety case as low as reasonably practicable. I think we've spoken a bit about that. Safety clear zone and sighting assessment. They're relatively new concepts, and I'll deal with those in a bit more detail. Safety management system, again, very well known. We're going to be using effectively the aviation safety management systems, mainly because we know the CAA is au fait with those. Hazardous materials, again, that's well known, HSE. The environmental assessment, well, we've already done one of those for the planning, so we can very much use that. And then security, well, there's a lot of security that is well known. You can use airport security. The only differences really are the technology safeguard agreement, which is due to be finalised here in Parliament, I believe, in July or so. And that's between the UK and the US, which allows US rockets and technology to come over to the UK and be launched from here. Now, that TSA is really quite important for the UK because American rockets can only be launched from America or New Zealand, Rocket Lab, or here in the UK now. They can't be launched elsewhere in the world. So from a commercial point of view, that's quite important for us. So let's just move on to the safety clear zone. So this is all about when you're doing your wet dress rehearsal. So a wet dress rehearsal will be when the rocket is brought out to the pad, it's put up into the vertical, and all of the fuel and the oxidizers, the commodities will be put into the rocket to test all the connections, pressure, etc., etc. You may or may not do a short engine burn there. We would expect those to happen in the early days, but probably not as companies become more experienced in launch. But when you're doing that, there is clearly now a danger because you put the oxidizer near to the fuel of there being an accident on the launch pad. And for that, again, we looked at the CFR 420, the FAA regulations of how big does that safety clear zone need to be. Now, what I would say here is that safety clear zone will only apply when the fuel and the, let's say, the liquid oxygen is in the rocket. Up until then, we're just going to be using standard health and safety COMA regulations here in the UK, So in this case, on the right-hand side, you can see all the commodities over on the left, and then the fuels will be over on the right. And those will be stored there, and you'll have fences around it, and that'll be absolutely standard COMA HSE regulations. We only start to get into what we really term the space regulations when we start to put them into the rocket at the same time. So then we look into, as I say, it's got 420 Appendix E. You then get into the question of what type of explosive division is the rocket now that it's got the fuel on board and the oxidizer on board. And there are two divisions. There's a 1.1 and a 1.3. The 1.1 division is really real explosives. So that is for an explosion, and that's where you get a rapid combustion of all of the parts of the explosive device, and you'll get a very strong reaction to that with lots of fragmentation, lots of blast overpressure, etc., etc. 1.3 is far more what we're dealing with, which is effectively a deflagration. So if you've got a lot of fuel and you set light to it, it doesn't all explode straight away. It deflagrates. So you do get a whoomph, but you don't get that massive explosion because the fuel is burnt over time relative to a 1.1. So from that, you can then start to work out the distances that need to be clear during a launch. Now, the importance from that is that nobody is allowed inside that. And therefore, if you as we've got with the 3 pads, we don't want them, so a safety clear zone would mean that we would have to clear all 3 pads at the same time, because as we've got other clients who'll be wanting to work on there, we would want them to not have to be clear off the site while a wet dress rehearsal is going on. So that's why we've spread our pads out so that we can get that concurrent operations. We then need to start again to bring in the UK regulations and how the UK views things. So in the US, they talk about intraline distances, and that's how far apart the fuel and the commodities need to be. Generally, it's about 100 feet. And if it's inside that, then all of the fuel and the oxidizer on the rocket is counted towards the explosive capability, but also all of the extra fuel and extra oxygen to the side of the pad is also included, which gives you a much greater safety clear zone. Just so as you know, in general, at a pad, they'll have about 2.5 times the amount of fuel and or commodities that are required to actually get into space to account for scrubs, boil off, etc., etc. So there is quite a lot actually stored near the pad. So you need to have them separated. So you can work that out the intraline, but then the intraline doesn't take into account berms, etc. Now, come back to ALARP, we could say in 420 that we've got it outside 100 feet, and therefore this is what the explosive distance is going to be. But HSE will immediately come back and say, well, why haven't you put them behind berms? There's got to be, is there a good reason? And there isn't. So we then need to start to jump or take into account the UK regulations in designing the pad themselves. So that required quite a lot of thought. We've got a good layout, and it will be very specific to each and every different rocket itself. Now, the other is the sighting assessment, and now we start to get into some quite complicated maths, etc., which I suspect a lot of people on here could do far better than I can. But this is again set out what the UK Space Agency expect is a numerical estimate the annualized risk of death or serious injury, and they expect to see all of the calculations, how we've gone about doing that prior to giving us a license. Now, there are 2 different ways of doing this, and we'll come on to that, and I'll tell you which one we're going for. And these are again shown in 42019, which is part of the launch site location review, which is what the Americans view sighting assessment as. Now, the two methods, but you have to start with what is your rocket. For the rockets that we're going to be launching in Shetland and throughout the UK, in fairness, they're all going to be small because the 90-degree inclination, and this is, can they put 3,300 pounds of payload to 100 kilometres? So if it's less than that, you're in the small class. And that means then that you can then start to look at all of the tables, etc., in CFR 420 to do your sighting assessment, or as the Americans call it, the launch site location review. So let's start with a more complicated way of doing it. This, and you can look this up yourselves on the internet. Bits of it are redacted because it is ITAR compliant, but this is publicly available. And this was done for the Hammond Spaceport, which is in Georgia, in their attempt to develop a spaceport there. Now, why did they go down this far more complicated way of doing it? Well, effectively because they are not slap bang on the coast. So you can see they're about 6-7 miles inland, which means that there are population centres, over which they have to fly. And that immediately gives them a number of issues, because they need to look at the probability of casualties for those population centres. So, any spaceport where the pads are not directly on the coast is going to have to do something like this. And they're generally done by the Aerospace Corps. They're quite expensive and quite time-consuming. But you can see here that they started with identifying all the local population centres. Now, interestingly, prior to coming on, we were talking about tourism coming up to watch a launch, and you would have to look at this and say, well, during a launch, those population centres are going to be increased because people are going to be there to look for the launch. So, how do you account for that? Nevertheless, they start and they look at where the populations are, the numbers of people that are likely to be there, summer campsites. Once they've done that, they then start to look at the fragmentation, which is over on the right-hand side, and to assess individual risk. So for this, they do, again, a lot of analysis on the rocket, its explosive force, how it's likely to fragment. They'll look at different weather patterns, etc., etc., and then they do Monte Carlo analysis, and they maybe do 100,000 runs to try and work out where those fragments are going to come down. And those fragments that they're interested in, they have they're basically got a size and weight associated with them and a force associated with them. So very similar, in fact, to the safety clear zone, which also has a fragment distance. The difference, of course, is that as the rocket is moving up in the air, those fragments can fly further, and you don't just have a 2D fragment hemisphere. You end up with a whole sphere of fragments coming out. So those fragments can start to go further. They can also, you have to take into account the three possibilities of failure. So the one failure is that the rocket explodes on the pad, which is effectively safety clear zone. And then you have that the rocket explodes in the air, either on the trajectory or after a malfunction turn. And that malfunction turn, they'll look at how far it can get off trajectory before the flight termination system kicks in. And then you have those fragments coming down. And then you also have that the rocket fails but comes down in one piece, as happened at Kodiak Island with Astra about 6 months ago. Comes down in one piece, again, either on the trajectory or off trajectory. So they have a look at all of those to see where the probability of causing injury to a person standing in the open during launch. And what we then need to think about here is the effect of height against probability. So as the rocket rises, the fragments can go a further distance. So initially, that area of the 10 to the minus 6 will increase. But then, as you get to a certain height, there'll be the same amount of fragments, but they're spread over a wider area. So your chance of an individual standing in a field starts to go down again. So there's a sort of crossover, and that's what you can see here. So you've got the 10 to the minus 6 in the middle, the dark red, and then it becomes minus 7 and minus 8 and minus 9. So all of those areas, fragmentations could come down. They're not saying that those areas that nobody has a chance of being injured. But what they're saying is the amount of fragments coming down per 100 square meters are getting less, so your chances of being injured are less. And that's it's quite an important thing to get your head round. So because we, particularly, and we'll come on to the CFR 420, they give sort of distances, but those distances are still based on probability. So they have a look at all of that, and then they can start to work out whether a launch is going to be successful. They then will also say, okay, what is the chances of launch failure? In this case, for Camden, they're doing launch and recovery. So they're saying 5% of launches will have a failure, and 5% of the recoveries will have a failure. So even when they end up with this 10 to the minus 6, they then have to apply in this case, 10% to that to then start to arrive at those estimated casualties. So hopefully you can see that is quite a complicated set of calculations that need to be done, and then quite complicated people need to understand exactly what they're seeing. And the reason they've had to do that is because they've got these populations underneath the flight path. For us, and this is where I did notice that Robin Brand was on. A big shout out to Robin. Robin's been up to the site. Thank you very much, Robin. So I've used part of Robin's report that he did for the BIS and using the 420 to show what we're planning to do here in Shetland. Now, the reason that we can use the 420 like this is 420 has evolved from a lot of those aerospace core analyses that I just showed you over the years. So they know that if it's a small rocket, that if you adhere to these distances, you will be inside that greater than 10 to the minus 6, outside that less than 10 to the minus 6. So if you don't have a complicated site, you can use this. And this is very much what we're planning to use. So we're using the small rocket distances, which in the case of from the launch point, the D-max, which is on the right-hand side, is 1.2 nautical miles. And then the DOEZ is 3.3 nautical miles. And then you have another 1.2. And that gives you then that overflight exclusion zone, which shows you the 10 to the minus 6 that we saw previously. But this is the thing is, when you first see 420, you just think these are numbers, but you've got to realize where those numbers have come from. They've come from experience of doing regular launches with failures, because launches will fail, and a lot of aerospace core analysis to come out with these solid numbers. And we will be using this for our site assessment and all of our calculations for expected casualties. And we're trying to do 30 launches a year. That doesn't mean that individual launches will end up with a 1.2 nautical mile exclusion zone, because the flight safety analysis will be done for each individual launch. And that again will look very similar to what we've just seen. And that will maybe only give us an 1,800 meter radius. And so for individual launches, those are the ones that we're going to apply. But for licensing purposes, we're going to be using CFR 420. Hopefully that's fairly self-explanatory. Now, before we come to questions, a spaceport without a range is a shed with some concrete, and that is it. So we've got to make sure that we've also got a range, and the range also comes down to safety as well. First thing you need to do is define the range, and you can see on the Google Earth, we've got effectively from 330 degrees true to 030 degrees true that we can launch into. That's not necessarily, that will result in different orbits clearly, but those are the launch azimuths. And then we need to think about the different exclusive economic zones over which we fly. And you can see the majority of it is Norwegian. There is a little bit of Faroe and Iceland, and a little bit of international waters to the north of us. So we need to take all of that into account. And then we need to think, okay, well, who and what is at risk in that area? If you were doing it over land, you'd look at population centres. But again, this is a big advantage for us, is there's not population centres up there, but it is still used. So it's used land, tiny bit of land around our site, and then the air, there's a certain amount of transatlantic traffic going over those, and then clearly sea as well, with fishing and various other maritime activities. So we needed to understand what is there, because without that you can't assess risk, and you can't then really start to work on getting a license. So what we've done is, and we did this with a firm called Aviso, and they got all of 2019, a whole year's worth of data from aircraft flying around with what's called ADS Bravo, which is a transponder which sends out height, speed, location of the aircraft, and it goes up to a satellite area on the people, and then from there it goes to people like NATS, and this is very much used in the commercial world now. It means that aircraft can fly closer together when they're outside of radar coverage, because they're being monitored through satellite. And we got them to have a really good look at the airspace usage. Yeah, we very much felt there was bugger all happening north of us, but we need obviously to have facts. So what they've done, and what you can see here, is they've looked at the whole year, and on the left-hand side you can see a heat map. I'm not a great fan of heat maps, because that red looks like it could be Piccadilly Circus, when in reality that might be 3 aircraft a day, but it has to be put in so as you can actually see it. But you can see in general very, very little happening north of us. The other thing is then we can look at time of day. So you can see generally from about midday is the greatest amount of aircraft. And then we can look at the levels, the aircraft on the right-hand side. So from that, we can see most of them are about 30,000 to 40,000 feet, therefore transatlantic traffic. And we can look at weekdays as well. We also broke it up into different months. You'll be unsurprised to hear that in the winter months, there's less traffic than in the summer months. So from all of this, we can start to work out when is the safest time to launch, if we do have a choice, and where the risk is likely to be. Now, again, as with all data, you've got to be very careful to make sure that you understand where the data is coming from. And the thing you need to understand from this data is it will take 2 or 3 hours for an aircraft to cross the area that you can see on the left-hand side. So one aircraft could appear 3 times in these various numbers. So, for instance, the flight level, they will probably increase the flight level as their fuel goes down. So they could appear in different areas of that. And equally, time of day, as it takes them 2 or 3 hours to move across. So you need to be aware there's any danger of double counting. Aviso took all of that into account, and what they then have been able to come out with is that in the whole year, 30,000 aircraft in that whole area. But the importance really is per 100,000 square kilometres, only just over 3 aircraft, which 100,000 kilometres is about all of Wales and all of Scotland. That's a very, very low density, which means that we're almost immediately ALARP, which is clearly a big, big advantage for us. Now, we've done exactly the same thing with the maritime. I just don't have as nice a graphic to show you on maritime. But within maritime, we also looked at oil rigs, pipelines, cables, everything to see where things are where they're going to come down, potentially what damage they could do. So we've done a huge amount of work for this. Obviously very interested in the drop zones in particular. and the drop zones in general are, absolutely nothing is happening up there. And what we can do is once a drop zone is determined, we can go to the data and we can say, okay, on this day in 2019, in that area were 2 aircraft for the whole of the 24 hours or ships. So, it's bringing out that capability and the data that's actually there. Now, this is new stuff. We couldn't have done this 5 years ago because the data just didn't exist. We'd have had to do regular updates, actual radar. So by doing this, we're using satellite space data to improve space launch. And I'll stop there. I don't know if I've overrun. I haven't looked at my watch. So I'm more than happy to take questions. I suspect that there will be some. I've probably haven't covered some of the things that people are interested in. So, over to you, Bob and Mark, and I'll take any questions.
Great. So thank you so much, Scott. That was a great talk. You did overrun, but I did mute you for the first part of it, so I think it's I think it kind of mined itself out. Right, everyone. Okay, this is how it works. I'll take questions. You need to attract my attention. You can do that by writing it in the chat. I've got some already, which I'll start to go through. Or you can try and do it by attracting my attention on the video if you've got your video on. So let's get started. So I think the first question I've got is from Ian Meek. Ian, if you want to ask this, it's about winter's weather and shelter. If you want to unmute yourself. If not, I can read it out for you.
Probably wise you read it out. I've forgotten what I wrote by this time.
I need to find it now. Let's see. Here we go. How many winters have you lived through in Shetland, Scott, was the first question. How bad does the weather get up there, and is the spaceport site well sheltered?
Well, it's a very good question, and it's the very first question we asked ourselves. Now, I personally haven't lived up there for a winter, but some of the directors have. So the very first thing we did was to get 10 years worth of weather data, and we're fortunate enough to have on the island a Met Office weather station at Baltersound Airport, which used to be the third busiest heliport in the UK in the 90s. And so we got 10 years worth of data from there, which included surface wind, 20-meter wind, precipitation, lightning strikes, etc., etc., etc. And we've then put that in a spreadsheet, and what launch providers can do, we give it to them under an NDA, is they can put in all of their weather limits for launch, and from that they can then predict how many days in each month they would have a launch window. So that costs about £14,000, and it told us that we could launch more in the summer than we could in the winter, which I didn't need to spend 14,000 quid on. However, again, it's getting those numbers. In the summer, it's about 95% of days, and in the winter, about 1 in 3. We also shared it with NASA, and they compared it with Cape Canaveral, and our weather windows are very, very similar to Cape Canaveral. Their issues over there are not wind, it's static in the air, which we don't suffer from. So the launch windows are pretty similar. And again, we've shared it, Lockheed have had it, ABL have had it, all our other potential clients have had it, and everybody keeps coming back to us. So yes, it can get quite miserable with the weather, there's no doubting that. And we will be building buildings that withstand that sort of weather. So when we're doing the design of the building, we've actually been talking to a lot of the locals and saying, right, you look at this, is this what you would build? Some of the crofters up there who have got a huge amount of experience. And, it's like, don't have overhangs because the wind can get underneath. So I've not lived up there for a winter. I suspect I will fairly soon. But we've got a lot of weather data, huge amount of it.
So Scott, I think we've got a problem with your sound. We're getting a lot of buzzing now that we didn't get during your talk. Are you plugged in okay?
Okay, hold on.
Okay. While you're doing that, so the next question we've got is from Mike Wake. I think you've got a couple of questions, Mike. You were asking about UK Space Command, and you were asking about the orbits that you would serve, that the spaceport would serve. Mike, do you want to ask that question?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So Scott, there's a UK spaceport being launched like within the last few weeks, actually. And the guy who's heading it up is a guy called Air Vice Marshal Paul Godfrey, and he's been going around various people like the Royal Aeronautical Societies and that, just telling them what their mission is. He did say he wanted to work with commercial launch providers as part of this. So I didn't know if you were aware of the Space Force had any engagement with them or intend to in the future.
Well, my background in the RAF, so I shared an office with Harv Smith, who's the Director of Space. So I know Harv quite well, and I do know Goddard as well. We served on the same... Is the sound better, by the way, Bob, now?
Nope. Oh, that's better.
Okay.
No, it's not.
Yeah. So yes, we have had conversations with the RAF and Space Command. They are very interested in leveraging commercial capabilities, effectively because they can't afford their own. So you saw that with the Earth Eye satellite that they put up, and that's half shared, so they use it 50% of the time, and Earth Eye use it the other 50%. And we would expect there to be a certain amount of, we'll call them governmental payloads, but is it going to become a military site? I doubt that very much, because they just don't have the money or the requirement for that. But access to space is quite clearly of interest to them. And they use a quite interesting word, assured access. So not necessarily interested in sovereign launch, but they want an assured access. Now, what that, the actual definition of that is interesting, and I don't know it exactly. So yes, we're very much aware. We have spoken to them. A couple of years ago, the Chief of the Air Staff visited UNT, and we did talk to them about Spaceport. So yeah, there's not a huge amount I can say about that, Mike.
Okay, that's right.
Apart from we are talking with them.
Yeah. The other one I had was obviously at that latitude, it sort of where you are, it dictates what kind of orbits you can achieve. So what kind of things are you intending to?
Yeah, it's very much sun synchronous and polar orbits. Absolutely, those are the ones that we're looking at. We did do some, some of the work. We can hit some of the orbits. OneWeb orbits, we can hit some of those. But it's very much polar, low Earth orbit.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Great. So next question we have is from Rodney Buckland. Rodney, you've got a question about liability. Do you want to ask that?
Yes. Okay. Will do. You mentioned. I think it was $60 million liability coverage. I assumed that was for the spaceport liability. And so there's an obvious question there. When does the liability transfer from the spaceport to the launch vehicle or the satellite operator or both?
For that, you should have our financial director on, Rodney, because it's something that concerns him a lot. So just for the 60 million is for the launch company. So during launch, they're probably going to have to insure up to 60 million euros or dollars. I'm not quite sure which. Above that, the UK government will cover the rest. Now, they are planning to use what's called a modelled or measured insurance requirement, whereby what they do is they look at the risk of the launch They look at the amount of people that can be injured, and they've got numbers against it. So I think when I looked at killing somebody is about 275,000 quid. Hitting a oil rig was like 5 billion. So they've got sort of numbers already associated with it. And you do this number and then you come out with how much you have to insure against. And if it's above 60 million, the UK government will cover the rest. Below that, it's covered by the launch company. Now, the liabilities between the spaceport and the launch company are clearly of great interest. Effectively, anything that the rocket is doing is their liability, and they will insure themselves against damaging our site and our equipment, and environmental cleanups, etc., will all be met by their liability. Our liability, we are very much in the arm's length normal sort of health and safety and industrial that any sort of landlord would have, but the real sort of meaty liabilities are all held by the launch company. That being said, there is a swap over between launch liability and like a wet dress rehearsal liability, and we've asked the question, we're not quite sure when that kicks in. Is it on pressing of the button, the first ignition, or is it when you first put the rocket onto the pad with the intention of launching? So that's not been cleared up, but from our point of view, all of the liability is being pushed towards the launch operator, and then the satellite will carry their own liability for when they're in orbit. So yeah, so a lot of shoulder dropping to put it onto somebody else.
Okay, so next question we've got is from, so we've got, next two will be Mikey DX, sorry, is it Mickey DX? You've got a question about logistics, and after that will be Robert Law. Mickey, have you got a question? Mikey? Okay, I don't have it in front of me. I think it was along the lines of, can you tell us a bit about the logistics of getting the equipment up to Shetland?
Yes, so again, we're really lucky in Shetland because of oil and gas, which Shetland has supported for about 50 years now, and you've got the Sub-Orbital oil terminal and the new gas sweetening plant up there. So we have two freight ferries arrive every day from Aberdeen, roll on, roll off, bringing all kinds of metal, etc., for the oil industry. So, very well served. We used to, prior to COVID, have about 28 flights a day out of Edinburgh, Glasgow, Manchester, all coming into Sunborough. So that part, is absolutely excellent. Once you get onto the island, then it is a case of you driving up, and you'll come onto what's called the mainland of Shetland. You then go onto the island of Yell, and then ultimately Untitled. And you have to take two short ferry rides, which one's about 15 minutes and the other's about 5 minutes. The roads also, and I think Robin Brandon will attest to this. I always say, if you can find a pothole up there, I'll give you £10, because the council is the richest council in the UK, because they get a cent on every dollar of a barrel of oil that comes ashore. So the roads are quite incredible. All, they're not single track roads, beautiful straight roads. So, we're very happy with the idea of logistics. And the rockets themselves generally are coming in standard 40-foot containers. So they're very much a well-known way of transporting stuff. Now, that does not mean that we don't think that some of our clients might actually bring in their rockets by boat directly to Unst, because we do have a pier there which can offload the various containers. But in general, we would expect it to come up through Aberdeen and then just by road up.
Great. So next question is Robert Law. Robert, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
I've actually got two questions. The first one is just out the insurance. Why are we talking about foreign currencies or for insurance from launching a rocket from the United Kingdom? Right. The second question is, this is going to be an historic moment in British spaceflight history, and lots of people, no doubt all here, would love to come up and see one of these. I would love to, I have to trail over to Cape Canaveral, so I would love to come up and watch one of these launches. At the beginning you mentioned there was some kind of tourist area. Is that still there, or will that not be possible? What are you going to do for public viewing in the United States? The people of Titusville and Cocoa Beach get a huge benefit out of rocket launches.
Yeah. Well, I'll avoid the one on different currencies, because that's those numbers are what has been given to me. But if we come on to tourism, absolutely, and we're doing got the Open University doing a study at the moment on tourism. We've identified areas where we think the best location for people to view the launches from. So there's a beach about 3 kilometres away from the launch site, and it's got a beautiful view of the launch site itself, and that will be a great location. And we're working with the Shetland Island Council on all of that visitor management, because we do expect a huge amount of people to come up. We currently, the tourist facility that we were running could take between 100 and 150 people, but some of that will obviously be used by engineers and people involved with the launch, but we're actually in the process of increasing those numbers. And further on in our plans, we'll have a hotel which will be able to take about 300 people. Now, there's also a whole number of different B&Bs and etc. on the island. One of the crofters who is in the grazing committee has already decided he's going to rent out his house to the BBC to come and monitor the launch, because he's got a great view of the launch site. So we do expect there to be a huge benefit for the local community, and we're very keen that they do benefit. So we've got a number of committees ongoing at the moment with Shetland Island Council and the various tourist facility organisations in Shetland, to make sure that all of the people involved in tourism are aware of the opportunity, how they can become part of it, and how they can benefit from it. So yeah, absolutely, come up and visit. We'd love to see you. I've got this cunning plan as well that when there's not a launch, we're going to have as much of the site open as possible. Q codes, and people be able to come along and take a Q code with their mobile phone, and then look through it, and you can have pseudo, what's the word? It's not artificial, but you'll be able to look through and see a launch happening on your screen. We're going to have huge amounts of tourism, and we want to embrace it, and particularly for the local people.
Yeah, thanks, that was fantastic. Well done. Right.
Okay, next up, no stranger to either of us, Robin Brand. Robin, you've got some questions about planning.
Yes, thanks very much, Bob. Good to see you again then, Scott, and thanks very much for a most interesting talk. And can I say it's most heartening to see this sort of activity going on in the UK. It's most encouraging compared with the sort of desert of activity that's happened over the last few decades. And if I could pick up on the living on Unst in winter point, coincidentally, when I was a boy, my family did live on Unst for a couple of winters. And I would agree with that business. You have to be careful with your buildings, because I clearly recall that somebody built a small row of bungalows up there in the traditional sort of overhang style you get in the mainland of the UK. And of course, after the first winter, all the roofs lifted and they had to put steel hawsers across to sort of fasten them down to avoid the next gales. It is calm up there. You can launch in winter, but when the wind blows, it can be very strong. Anyway, moving on to my couple of questions. The first is, obviously, as most people will be aware, you're undergoing a planning process at the moment. And I see from your website you had some objections from the sort of environmental agency or whatever it's called in Scotland. So I'm wondering when you anticipate having a result of the planning application. And secondly, on the matter of the range, has a range operator been sorted out? Right? Are you going to operate the range yourself, or have the UKSA actually got somebody to become a range operator now?
Okay, I'll deal with the planning first. So it's the only statutory respondee who came back with a bit of an objection, Historic Environment Scotland, because it's the old radar, Second World War radar site. So we're working with them currently, and we do, expect to be able to get that sorted in the next 4 or so weeks. We're aiming really to get planning permission in and around June, because that's the timings that the planning committees meet. And we're aiming, therefore, to actually start construction in about mid-August. So everything, we're still confident, Robin. Doing a lot of work with the council. Obviously, you need to do it at arm's length because you can't be there influencing them. But it's really just the Historic Environment Scotland, and we are working very closely with them. So as far as the range, we aim to be the range operator. And we think this is really quite important because the whole point of the Pathfinder launch is to create a UK launch capability, a UK launch industry. So if we are going to start subcontracting out the range, then we here in the UK will not be gaining a lot of the experience and qualifications that we need to become a sovereign launch nation. So it's very much, we will be the launch, the range licensee. Now that does not mean that we won't bring in subcontractors, certainly in the early days, to get us moving along with the various bits of infrastructure that are required. And we are talking to a number of subcontractors that can come in and do that. But this is where what we've got to do, and this is why I wanted to show you all that work we've done on the airspace and the sea space, because we got not dumb this down, but there is a danger that we overcomplicated in this country, that we look at what we've done on the military ranges out of Benbecula, which is launching into where all of the transatlantic traffic is. MOD got a completely different view on risk, etc., and we'll just price ourselves out of the market. So we've got to do this in a pragmatic way, which still achieves safety, but isn't overly complicated. We're not going to have aircraft out monitoring the drop zones, etc., because there is nothing to monitor. So it's that sort of, it's a balance between bringing in a certain amount of expertise and trying to do as much of it ourselves as we here in the UK can benefit. And one of those, and this is what qualifications does somebody need to be the person who presses the button on the flight termination? Now, if you look over in the States, they've got all kinds of qualifications. But if you draw back and, I'm used from the military, you do, what is the task? What does that person need to be able to do that task? And actually, what they're doing is they'll have a screen, they'll have a position where the rocket is, they'll be showing constantly the instantaneous impact point, and then they'll have effectively track lines either side. And if that instantaneous impact point goes onto one of those track lines, they press the button. Now, do you need a PhD in rocket science to do that? I would suggest you don't. We need to create the right qualifications for the task that they're actually undertaking. The people who do the flight safety analysis, quite clearly PhD, but I'm not convinced the people actually pressing the button need that. And that's really, all part and parcel of this Pathfinder is us here in the UK working out how we are going to do it in the UK. Yes, we'll look at how it's done in other countries, but some of it will replicate and some of it we'll do in a different way. Does that help explain it, Robin?
It does indeed. Thanks very much indeed.
Okay, so the next two questions are going to come from Keith Burrow. Keith, you've got a question about Nat Presswick, and then after that it'll be John McAvoy. Keith, do you want to ask your question? Keith Burrow? No? Okay. Okay, here we go. Oh no, it's not the one. Actually, so we just go straight on. I'll come back to Keith's question. John McAvoy, you've got a question about types of payload and limitations. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, there was a couple of small questions, really. I just wondered, because it seems to be a northern launch window, I just wondered how that would restrict the orbit and the type of payload that you'll undertake. That was the first question. And then my other thought was, it's obviously a UK project, and I'm thinking about Nicola Sturgeon, who was quite a nationalist. And if she gets her way and Scotland becomes independent and she takes you back into Europe, I just wondered how that would affect the project. I hope it doesn't put a border across England, Scotland, but it could come to that. Depends how Europe see it.
Yeah. Okay, we'll deal with the first one. Yeah, quite right. It's going to be northerly launches, so therefore into polar orbit, sun synchronous. So you can expect the to be small sats from nanosats up to maybe 300 or 400 kilograms. So Internet of Things and Earth observation is likely to be the majority of the payloads. Scottish independence, yeah. Now that is a very interesting one, and there are a number of issues potentially with it. What I would say to start is the Scottish government is very, very supportive of this and us because 60% or more CubeSats are built in Glasgow than at the rest of the world outside of Silicon Valley. So Scotland's already got quite a successful space industry, be it satellite production and also the analysis of the data. So they are very, very supportive of it. I think the issues would become the international agreements that have to be in place for rocket launch. You've got the MTCR, countries being part of that, a new country coming online and being part of that, outer space treaty, anything to do with independence. And I wouldn't say it's just space. They would have to create their own space agency. So there's a whole load of things. Could it be done? Yes. Does it make sense to do? Well, that's really for the electorate, isn't it, to make their decision on that. So there would be challenges there. The other thing is Shetland actually quite often looks to get independence from Scotland, and there was something in the papers about 6 months ago again of Shetland looking at independence from Scotland. So you may end up with where Scotland became independent and Shetland came away from Scotland and stayed with the UK. Yeah. So I don't know, John. That there's a lot of things that could happen, but I think the bottom line is both the UK government and the Scottish government are very supportive of this.
That's good.
Okay, next up, I'm just going to jump down to Mark Perman. Mark, you've got a question?
Hi, Scott. I was just wondering, I've had some experience shifting 1.3S category motors and propellants around. I wondered how the ferry companies feel about this sort of thing.
Well, they're quite sanguine about it, but you're quite right. But if you let's look at RP1, because we're not talking solid propellants in general. Some of these sounding rockets might be solid. So you've got RP1, and some rockets can use Jet A1. So that already comes up on the ferries. The gases also come up on the ferries. When we had a space symposium, about 3 years ago now, and a whole load of people came up, and we went round the Lerwick Harbour, which moves 1 million tonnes of cargo a year, and we saw hydrogen peroxide being offloaded there. So they've already got all of those licenses for all of those things, because again, the gases, helium is used quite a lot in the oil industry, liquid nitrogen is used a lot in the oil industry. So we're not seeing a huge problem with that, to be quite honest, Mark.
Good.
Next up, we've got John Bonser.
You're muted, John. I can see.
John, you're muted. You're still muted.
I'm glad it's not just me who managed to do that.
Okay, John, I'm just going to jump in while you fiddle with that. Please feel free to go to switch your microphone on. So I've got the question from Keith Burrow. So Keith was on his microphone's knackered, so I'm going to read it. He's asking, is it intended to just launch or also provide ongoing long-term ground control and satellite data acquisition by building local infrastructure, buildings, antennae, personnel on site? Or will you outsource this function?
Yes, we are. We will have a satellite antenna for that is arriving in June, due to be operational in July, and we've got a number of customers already for that. So absolutely, yes, we definitely intend to do that.
And he's got one more question. He's asking, do you expect to get a go, no-go from NATS at Prestwick with a tie-in with RAF SOC in case of QRA flights?
Not really from them, no, because the FIR, Flight Information Region, ends about 12 nautical miles north of the site, so then into Eurocontrol. So we will have a temporary danger area, airspace around our site, which we will activate for launch. But the rockets will be above 60,000 feet within about 5 kilometers north of the site, at which point, they're well above that. So we're not expecting that with NATS at all. We have spoken to them, and we've also spoken to Eurocontrol as well. But no, is the answer to that.
Okay, John, you're up.
Yeah, sorry, my computer froze for a while. Actually, it wasn't a question I had. By the way, Scott, nice to see you again. You may remember we met back in 2019 when Rick Jones and I came up for the UNS Festival. I believe you're still looking after our almost completed Saturn V. I don't know whether it's still...
Pride of place in the foyer of our offices at the moment.
Yeah, I know that was brilliantly looking after it. I still hope to get up there and complete the job and actually launch it one day, but obviously that's good. But we'll talk to you about that some other time. No, my comment was actually just to Mark, his question about the ferry companies being okay. What was their feeling about moving propellant? And you've kind of answered that. But my comment to Mark was, well, back in 2019, when Rick Jones and I came up, we had to do the paperwork to bring up a certain amount of ammonium perchlorate-based propellant, and that was completely straightforward. And the tickets we were given, the second ferry, you were describing the island hopping, the second ferry we went on, the chap came to the car and we showed him the paperwork, and he said, well, just as long as you don't blow us up. He was quite sanguine about the whole thing. I mean, thanks again. I mentioned to Mark, when we were actually up there, we got a tremendous amount of help from yourselves and at the actual facility. And just if I may make the comment, there's comments been made about the level of support. The the very strong impression that Rick and I came away from that exercise from, which was successful up to a point, but not completed. But there's a very strong can-do attitude on us amongst everybody. And all the comments we got from the other people we dealt with there, the Arts Festival people, as you say, they were very supportive. The local people are very supportive of what we're trying to do. And it fits in, this enterprise of yours, the Shetland Space Centre, fits in very well with the whole can-do attitude that seems to exist on us, and I think throughout the Shetland Islands. So with that backing, I think you've got every chance of being successful.
Thank you very much, and we'd love to have you back up there, John. You're quite right. The can-do attitude is very front and centre in the whole of the Shetland Islands. And as far as the ferries, when we had the Chief of the Air Staff up, he, on the second of the bigger of the ferries, you'll remember, John, the captain invited him up to the bridge and let him drive it and get everything. So,
oh wow!
Yeah, very, very friendly people.
By the way, say hi to Frank and everybody else we met up there.
I will do.
My best wishes. Thanks, Bob.
Okay, right. And I missed out Andy McGarry. Sorry, Andy, you've got a question about community engagement.
Yes, thanks a lot. I think my question just got lost in all the sound quality related messages. So Scott, thanks very much for your very thorough and interesting and lots of technical insight into this aspect of the spaceport development. I was wondering if you've also had a campaign to engage with the public, the local communities and other stakeholders to help share and explain these analyses and activities and provide visibility and reassurance. And if you've already done that, I was just wondering how it's been received.
Yes, but it has to remain ongoing, Andy. So a lot of what I do is education to a lot of people, because first up they think it's going to be Cape Canaveral, and then you have to sort of talk to people, but this is why we make sure that everything is freely available. We show them all of these analyses, etc., because they need to be able to make up their own minds. But it's going to be ongoing, absolutely, and we need to have the local population on side. The intention is that we'll use a lot of the locals when we need to secure the exclusion zones. Make them very much part of it. And that they feel that they've got a stake in it. So we talk regularly to the community council. We talk to them about how we will go about letting people know when launches will be, what will then happen. Because as I'm sure you're aware, one thing you can guarantee is the launch isn't going to go on time.
Yeah.
And so you've got to maintain all of those communications with the local population. We're aiming to do a number of sub-orbital launches this summer, and this is all part and parcel of what we're really referring to as like a test and evaluation. But part of that is identifying who are the local stakeholders that need to know things, when they need to know it, how they need to get that information, and then how they then disseminate that within their own communities. Because it's very easy to say, oh, we're just going to do this. But when we did our planning consultation, because of COVID, we couldn't do it in person, so we had to do it online. But there's a number of people up in Unst who are not, particularly internet au fait. So we also offered, we would do direct phone conversations with them, and we had people sending questions. You've got to try and reach out to people in the most appropriate way to them. One of the local guys, a chap called Willie, who would visit, he's close to one of the roads, and he's really supportive of it. I think because I only understand about 50% of what he says, Andy, because he's got such a broad accent. So again, we get we've got local people that we talk to them on a regular basis, and they can then go out to talk to the locals. But we don't see it as a one-off thing. Has to be continuous.
Yeah. And I'm just interested to understand, the presentation was quite technical. So do people absorb it just the way you've given it today, or do you present it in a slightly different, more accessible way?
I felt that this audience would probably be quite technical. So I would present it in a different way if it was to the UNTS Community Council. Just, expected casualties. That sounds quite terrifying if you're not used to that. But, that's 1 in a million. Is that saying if we do one launch a year, one person dies or gets injured every million years? So, yeah. So hopefully I wasn't wrong. I thought you as a team would be a bit more technically minded than if I was talking direct to the UNTS Community Council. And I don't mean that in any derogatory way at all.
No, it was fantastic to get so much detail, but as we've seen in the past year and a bit, politicians, the public, have a real struggle understanding numbers, statistics, probabilities. So it's good that you're thinking about that aspect.
Yeah, they do.
Thanks a lot.
Politicians in particular, Andy.
Yeah, I can imagine. Good luck.
Thank you.
Okay, next up, I'm going to read out a question from Henley Mallory, who's also got some microphone problems. He's saying with US ranges now having the requirement for, I think it's, what was it?
Automated flight termination.
Yeah, flight termination system, isn't it? Why is this not being used to eliminate the flight termination system job? And he follows on that question with asking about how far is automation being used to reduce costs?
Yes, so automated flight termination systems, we fully expect us to be using those in the next 2 years. The reason we're starting with the man in the loop is because we don't think the regulator is in a position yet to accept automated flight termination system, despite they're being used in America. The regulator, in fairness, they've never regulated this before. So they're very risk averse. So that's why we're starting with that. That doesn't mean that some of the clients in 2 years' time wouldn't be, when they first come to us, be using AFTS straight away, but it's a step process. So yeah, we fully expect it to go that way in the next couple of years.
Next up, a question from Bob Morris. Bob, you've got a question about staffing.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, very interesting, Scott. Very interesting. The questions that I had really were around the sort of numbers of staff that you're likely to have. For instance, once you're up and running, how many staff would you have on the site normally? And then during a launch campaign, how many would you have there? And also, again, the other staff, admin, etc., marketing, will they all be based on that site or will they be based somewhere else? And if so, where?
Okay, so I'll talk, because obviously the rocket manufacturer will be bringing their own people. So we talk about our people. It depends. 30 launches a year, you're going to have a whole number of people. 10 launches a year, less. You're going to have, to start with, security is going to have to be there. You're going to have people dealing with bringing, because we're going to provide all of the gases and the fuels. So we'll have people doing all of that. We'll have people doing maintenance on the site, electrical engineers, IT engineers and mechanical engineers for all of what we're actually doing as, let's call it, the facilities management. However, where we want to go is to operate it very similar to an airport. And if you look at firms like Astra, who, as I say, launch out of Kodiak, their hope is that they'll only ever send 4 people to launch one of their rockets, because they'll use employees of the spaceport to do a lot of the work around for their rocket launch. So they're trying to take everything as much as possible into that aviation side of things. So as we would have people who would be doing the fueling for them, be putting in the gases, etc., etc. So that's where we want to get to, Bob, and that, in which case we would be creating a lot more jobs on the island. You know, things like forklift drivers. You know, if they don't have to bring them, if we can have somebody doing that, that's what we intend to do. We're not going to have that straight away because a lot of these companies, you know, they start with all of their people, but I think we'll end up in the Astra way that they want to send as minimum amount of people and get as much done by the spaceport. Admin jobs, etc. We've got offices near Granton-on-Spey, so that's where our HR will remain, and a certain amount of the admin support. But what we've actually got a German company doing engine tests in Skatster, which is an airfield on the island currently, and you have to have people on site to deal with the questions that arrive at the time. You cannot do that remotely. So there's going to be a certain amount on Granton, but there's going to be, you know, the vast majority on island. And when I say island, I mean Unst, Yell, and the mainland itself. And hopefully, if we can move to the Astra, the aviation, a lot of jobs. But I can't give you specific numbers. Within the environmental impact assessment, they have given numbers, but that, what I would say to that is, that's a very formulaic way that has to be done for planning. It's just, you know, numbers in, numbers out, and it doesn't pick up the nuances of actually how you would end up running a spaceport. Does that help, Bob?
Yeah, thanks. And you said you're thinking of having some suborbital launches, are you, this summer?
Absolutely. So we intend to do suborbital as well as orbital, because clearly it's more business. So we aim to do that. A lot of companies, you know, look at Skyrora, you know, their testing and evaluation phase is they start by doing suborbitals. And we're very much of the view, if somebody comes to us and does their suborbital testing, they'll stay with us. So we can almost loss lead on that to get them to come and do the orbital launches. So we've got, I mean, just this, you know, last 4 weeks, I think we've been approached by about 5 or 6 people wanting to do suborbital launches. So yeah, definitely a lot of suborbital. And then also potentially balloon launches, so B2 Space with their balloons, you know, that they can launch from us as well. So yeah, you know, the more activity we have, the better.
Good luck anyway. Very interesting. Good luck.
Thanks, Bob.
Okay, next one. I think we've actually got the same question from 2 people who are discussing on the chat going on. It's Ian Meek and Nabil Suhair, and they're asking about eastward launches to try and take advantage of the 200 meters per second rotation of the Earth advantage that you get from it. And Ian also says that it might also be dockable. So let me see if I can put that in the form of a question. Actually, Ian, do you want to ask it?
If I can unmute, has that worked? I think that's worked. I was basically, I mean, obviously you're launching north, so that's great for polar orbits. But the question was, can you go east as well, or do you hit too many oil rigs and Norwegians? And if you go east, and I'm not an expert, unfortunately, does that mean you can then start docking with all sorts of interesting stuff that's being launched from the equator anyway?
It's a very, very good question. We've looked at the range. Effectively, 030 takes us along the coast of Norway, staying at least 12 nautical miles off the coast. And then we've looked at where the oil rigs are and most of the aviation. So you're probably more likely about 028 type of thing to avoid all of that, so as you can keep your risk levels down. If we were wanting to launch to OneWeb, it's about a 010 launch trajectory because they're not pure polar. So yes, we can go east a bit. If you want to go seriously east, you'd have to end up doing a dogleg, you know, later on, and that brings in other issues. So yeah, there's lots of options there. it would come back to, does it make any sense for somebody to do it from our site rather than somebody else's site? My suspicion is, well, it's the majority is going to be polar sun synchronous, with some, as I say, the OneWebs, we can support them as well.
And I should say, I see you've also got a whiskey distillery up there. Congratulations.
Yes, I saw that as well. Yes, we do our own gin. So we did a gin recently called Lost Gin Space, and there's a new one going to come out. I forget the name, but I shouldn't probably tell you. But there's one's going to come out. It'll be a countdown to the launch as a special gin. So yeah. Look out for it in all good supermarkets.
Well, I'll come up and open a champagne place so as we can celebrate the first launch.
Yeah.
Next question I've got is from Debbie Nelson. Debbie, you've got a question about US rockets and how we get them to Shetland.
Yes, hi. I'm actually over in the US, and so I found this very interesting. I'm with Nixine Publishing, and I was curious as to if these US rockets can launch from there. How are they going to get there? Are they coming in through the port where the oil industry is using? Is it big enough? How is that going to be managed?
So they will be shipped, and they will probably arrive in somewhere in England, perhaps Liverpool, by shipping. And then there are two options there. They can either go by road, because they're standard 40-foot containers, and then go by road to Aberdeen and then ferry up to Lerwick, as I described. Or they could go on another smaller ship, which would then dock actually in Unst. So there's a couple of ways of bringing them over. But this whole industry is about making things simple. So they design all of their rockets so they fit into standard 40-foot containers, or in the case of ABL, it's a 53-foot container. So it's all about making those logistics easy. The issues that really then come in is making sure you've got the right paperwork for the technology to come over, because it's ITAR, dual-use technology. So there's a lot of paperwork and security aspects to it. But again, that's a pretty well-trodden path between the UK and the US anyway. So effectively, shipping from the US, come across the Atlantic, and then either road or another ship up.
It's really interesting. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
No problem at all.
Okay, next question we've got is from Ranjay Gogoi. I hope I've pronounced your name right. And you've got another question about automated flight termination systems.
Hello. Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. I've forgotten what I said now. I think it was about the automated flight termination system, and there was something you mentioned about the regulator. They actively discourage that, because I was assuming if it's a proven system and reliability studies give sufficient confidence, and they would accept that. And I should probably give you fair warning that I work for the proposed regulator.
Well, you work for the CAA, do you?
Yes. Yeah.
Lucky chap. Yeah, I think it will happen. I mean, all I can say is, when I've been to various plenary sessions and I've spoken to, the regulators and the bosses there, they're trepidatious about automated flight termination systems at this point. They want to see that they are well proven, and that they want to see that there's a proper demonstrable development phase to them, and all of the safety analysis that's gone with them. I don't think it's going to be too far away, because you've already got NASA that use AFTS, and there's a number of free access to AFTS over in the States. Astra use it. SpaceX are going to start to use it. So I'm pretty sure the regulator will go that way. I just think at the moment they want to walk before running, so that they want to go back to a very tried and tested system first. So yeah, hopefully I haven't been too rude about your employer. Brad.
No, not at all. I mean, it was something I was surprised because I don't think we've actively discouraged anything. And, like you said, perhaps it will be a walking before you can run approach.
Yeah, it's just, I speak to Colin McLeod and quite regularly, and it'll be a quicker licensing process for us to use man in the loop than go straight to AFTS. And because we've got, a time constraint, that's, excuse me, a good way of going. But no, I'm not saying you're discouraging it. I just, it's just trepidatious, I think is a better word.
No, that's fair. Well, thanks.
No, pleasure.
Okay, Mark, you've got a question about sounding rockets, and just before you ask it, I can see that Rodney Buckland's also commented that that spare Australian surface-to-air missiles have been converted to sounding rockets and launched from Woomera for the University of Kent. So anyway, on to you, Mark.
About 20 years ago, I was involved from the industry side with the idea of a similar program to what has been done in Norway, where the Norwegians have had this very successful program for many years where they take life-expired military hardware, military rocket motors, bolt them together and use them as sounding rockets. So basically you get a virtually free propulsion system made available to you. So we thought about doing the same thing over here. We tried to get interest. We had some interest from universities, industry. Unfortunately, BNSC at the time just weren't interested at all. But I wondered if you'd consider that sort of thing rather than going down the route of, say, the toy rocket or hobby rockets that you can get at the larger end of those and building and using those for sounding rockets.
Well, we're actually dealing with, so you've got people like Raptor Aerospace who build their own sounding rockets, and it's a business, so you've got them. But the ones we're going to do coming up are actually, they're small orbital rockets because they're part and parcel of the development process for the full orbital launch. But even though that those companies are intending to keep those rockets to service the sounding rocket market, and we're talking about going to 200 kilometers. We're talking, serious sounding rockets. So we're not talking, 40-odd thousand feet. Yes, I mean, we want to be able to do sounding rockets because we see that there is a market there, and particularly here in the UK, where actually we've done a lot of sounding rocket launches, but we've just not really publicised the fact. I mean, John and co, there's a lot of people have done those sorts of things. So we do think there's going to be a market there, but the ones we're doing at the moment are the ones that are leading to the orbital launch. So they'll be testing their actual engines, etc., etc.
Yeah, all I would suggest is that if by using ex-military hardware, you've got relatively large propulsion systems that you can get hold of compared to the sort of stuff that John and Rick use and I use. I'm a hobby rocketeer. So you can go, you can put together quite a capable sounding rocket very, very, very cheaply. And it's a great way for you for training range operation staff, for instance, and involving schools. You can launch, you can provide a small rocket and launch a payload, just have a school to provide the payload or a university to provide payloads. It's you could use that for your outreach program.
Well, we were intending to do last summer a couple of suborbitals for exactly that with a university, but COVID got in the way and we couldn't do it. But yeah, absolutely, we've looked at that because we see it as part and parcel of our development, but we want to bring on, you know, the future business. So, you know, by using university students come up and they can practice because they're going to be our clients in 10 years or so.
Yeah.
So yeah, absolutely. It's really COVID that has stopped us on that mark thus far.
Thank you.
Just following on from that, Rodney Buckland was just saying that the University of Kent used spare Zuni missiles to launch student payloads from Woomera. I think that was about 10, 15 years ago. He also said the International Space University did some as well. Mike Wake, Mike, I think this is similar to the question we had earlier. But, Mike, do you want to ask your question about telemetry ground stations and data collection?
This is something I do, you know, as part of day job. Actually, is instrumentation, data collection, that kind of thing for rockets. Actually, so will you be offering services for the the launch companies in terms of doing all the ground station and instrumentation and data collection, or will they sort of bring their own people to do that?
We want to do as much as possible. So, coming back to that analogy of an airport or an airline. So if you fly on EasyJet, which I know none of us will have done recently, they'll say that their partner in hire cars is maybe Europcar. So we aim to have sort of partners for the LEOP support, because obviously there's a chunk of that, and we can also be part of that with our own ground stations. So we're going to put some ground stations in UNT, but we're also actively looking at other parts of the world, which I can't really tell you at the moment, to create a wider network of that. So do we, the rocket companies, they want to do as little as possible. That they want to come up and just arrive and have everything there ready for them so they can launch very quickly and go away. So the answer is yes. We will have those on site. If they wanted to bring them their own, you then start to run into Ofcom license issues and everything. So it's not as simple. It's the same with if they started wanting to just bring their own liquid oxygen as well. They would also have to have all those licenses. So it makes far more sense that the Spaceport does all of that. So effectively, yes, if that helps, Mike.
Yes, okay, thank you.
Okay, Andre, and then after that it will be Graham Sherville. Andre, we can't hear you. I can see you're not muted, but we still can't hear you. Okay, Andre, what I suggest is you type the question into the chat and we move on to Graham Sherville.
Yeah, thanks, Bob, and thanks, Scott. Great, very interesting presentation, obviously. I've got just a simple question about the integration stage. You get the rocket in a couple of shipping them in the launch adapter are going to be, well, you can tell me 10, 20, 30 different payloads from probably 5 or 6 different suppliers. And where is that integration going to take place of putting all the spacecraft onto the launch adapter? Is that going to be done on site, or is that going to be done off site? So everything has to come already bolted, tested, and configured. Thank you.
So we're expecting the vast majority of it to be done on site. So the integration hangar will have 2 clean rooms. We'll have one quite a large clean room, which will cater for 250 kilogram plus type of satellites, and then we'll have a clean room which is really dedicated more to the CubeSats. You could get into the situation where, let's say you've got an orbital maneuvering vehicle, the CubeSats could be loaded, down south, say in Harwell, and come up. But actually, we expect a vast majority of it to be done on site, which is the traditional way of that actually occurring. And that, so within the integration hangar, you'll have the area which is just for the rocket, and they'll have their own offices, and then next to it will be the clean rooms, and there'll be what we call the payload clients offices there with the roving rooms, etc., and then the clean room itself. So effectively everything on site. Whether that's the way the market will keep going, Graham, don't know. I suspect it'll generally stay like that, but I think the nanosats, you could have that done off site and brought up ready to go. Some launch operators we're looking at will only have a capability of maybe putting 20 kilograms of payload up there. So that might very well suit them.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay, so Ian Meek, again, Ian, you've got a question about maximum size of stages that can actually be delivered to the launch site.
Well, that's my question.
Well, at the moment, ABL is a 53-foot container. So that's the largest we're working on at the moment, Ian. I've not spoken to any other clients that are bigger than that. And I'm not expecting to get bigger than that because, again, their whole philosophy is ease of logistics. Keep it down to a 40-foot container. It's very much their thinking. If it was larger, we could do it because we've built wind farms up there. So it is possible, but you're then looking at having special road transport and that sort of thing. So I would expect it to be 53 foot and less.
Okay, is there any more questions? Have we done it? Have we got to the end?
When can I book my ticket?
Yeah. Frank, we went over to Cape Canaveral and we met with Blue Origin people. Frank would love us to be able to do the new Shepherd launches out of there, but I think let's walk first before we start doing that. So a few years yet, John.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to draw it to a close now. So, Scott, thank you so much for such a great talk, and you actually did pitch it perfectly for BIS members. It's the sort of talk that gets us going. And in the comments, there's a lot of well wishes for you and the venture. I think it's very exciting to have that here in the UK, and as Robin Brand said, it's been a long time since we've got excited about things actually happening here in the UK with regard to that. So thank you very much.
Thank you.